Mark watched the stacked chairs in the empty restaurant hall. The dim lights illuminated what once had been his family's pride. The Harvest restaurant had passed through generations, from his grandfather to his father, and finally to him. During his childhood, Mark remembered how the place buzzed with energy, filled with conversations and laughter. The aroma of his father's secret recipes drew customers from all over town. Now, all that remained was silence. Even on the best days, the few occupied tables weren't enough to pay off the mounting debts. The guilt and weight of not being able to uphold his family's legacy consumed him. His father, who had passed away 5 years ago, had left a deep mark on Mark. He always said, taking care of the restaurant means taking care of the family. But now, with the financial crisis, competition from modern new restaurants and the personal problems that had piled up, like his recent divorce, the restaurant felt like a distant memory of what it once was. The spark in Mark's eyes had faded, and he wondered how much longer he could hold on. That night, as he locked the restaurant doors, he saw a familiar figure outside. Jack, the homeless man who frequently passed by, was crouched, rummaging through a trash bag. Next to him, his 10-year-old daughter Caroline watched him with wide, worried eyes. Mark hesitated for a moment. He knew Jack's story. Many in town did. Jack was a former construction worker, respected by everyone for his hard work, until an accident pulled him away from the job sites. Unable to work, he lost everything: his home, his wife, who died from a treatable illness, and almost lost himself. Now he lived on the streets, doing what he could to care for Caroline. Mark opened the door slowly, catching the attention of the two. Jack looked up, a mix of surprise and shame on his face. He hated being seen in that situation, but needed to find something for his daughter. "Jack," Mark began, unsure of what to say. "Is everything okay?" Jack remained silent for a moment, but Caroline, full of hope, answered, "We're fine, Mr. Mark. Just looking for something to eat." The sincerity in the girl's voice hit Mark like a blow. He knew their situation wasn't temporary, and that Jack was struggling to survive day by day. A wave of compassion washed over him. Memories of his father, always generous to those in need, surfaced in his mind. "Come in," Mark said, gesturing toward the door. "There's enough food here for both of you." Jack hesitated, his pride holding him back, but Caroline's empty stomach spoke louder. They followed Mark inside the restaurant. The warm air and smell of food, almost ready, was a relief. Without saying a word, Mark began preparing a plate with the leftovers of the day. Caroline watched everything with bright eyes, as if this moment were a small miracle. "Thank you," Jack finally murmured, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "I don't know how I'll pay for this, but—" "Don't worry about that now," Mark interrupted, serving the plate. "These tables have been empty for a while. It's nice to have someone here." As they ate, Mark watched the interaction between father and daughter. There was a tenderness there, even in the midst of their adversity, that made him think of his own father. The memories of his father's teachings and generosity came flooding back, and he wondered how he had let the restaurant reach this point of decline. For a brief moment, an idea crossed his mind. Maybe helping Jack and Caroline could be a way to give new purpose to the restaurant and to his own life. He didn't know how, but something inside him began to change at that moment. In the quiet of the restaurant, Mark felt a small spark of hope. Little did he know, that simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change their lives forever, in ways he could never have predicted. In the days that followed, Jack and Caroline returned to Mark's restaurant. The winter cold in Winchester was growing more and more cruel, and finding shelter had become a matter of survival. Moved by a mix of compassion and nostalgia, Mark decided to let them stay in the restaurant during the nights, away from the freezing streets. He improvised a space in the back, where he stored cleaning supplies, with a few mattresses and blankets. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them warm and provide the sense of safety that Jack and Caroline so desperately needed. Despite hesitating at first, Jack began to accept Mark's help. His wounded dignity still bothered him, but his daughter's well-being came first. He knew that if they stayed on the streets, Caroline would get sick. They had already endured so many hardships that he couldn't let anything worse happen. As Mark watched Jack and Caroline adjust to the restaurant's routine, a sense of purpose began to grow within him. The restaurant, once a place he associated with failure and loss, now seemed to have a new meaning. The hallways, once empty and silent, now echoed with Caroline's soft laughter as she helped Jack with small tasks. That innocent presence brought new energy to the place. One night, Mark was at the kitchen counter going over the few orders of the day when Caroline quietly walked in and sat on one of the stools. She watched Mark's hands as he cut vegetables with precision, something his father had taught him years ago. Fascinated, she observed as if she were watching a true artist at work. "What are you doing?" Caroline asked, her childish curiosity evident in her voice. Mark smiled slightly, something he didn't do often. "Preparing some dishes for tomorrow," he replied, focused but friendly. "I've never seen anyone cut that fast," Caroline commented, her eyes shining with admiration. "My dad taught me," Mark said, not realizing how much those words affected him. He did it almost instinctively, without thinking, but when he mentioned his father, he felt a pang in his chest. "He always said that in the kitchen, you need precision and patience." Caroline tilted her head, absorbing those words with a wisdom beyond her years. "I'd like to learn how to cook like you," she said suddenly. Mark paused for a moment, looking at the girl. There was something in the way she spoke, so full of hope and determination, that reminded him of himself as a child, watching his father in the kitchen with the same fascination. He saw a reflection of his own past in her words, and something stirred inside him. "Maybe one day," Mark replied with a gentle smile. In the following days, Caroline began spending more time around Mark in the kitchen. She watched closely as he prepared simple dishes, and sometimes Mark let her help, teaching her small tricks like how to chop vegetables or stir a pan at just the right moment. This unexpected interaction began to awaken a part of Mark that he had buried a long time ago, the joy of sharing what he loved. Meanwhile, Jack became a more constant presence in the restaurant, helping with the small repairs the place desperately needed. He didn't want to be just a burden to Mark, and despite his weakened physical condition, he found ways to contribute. With a hammer and a few old tools, he started fixing broken chairs, squeaky doors, and other things that had fallen into disrepair. The restaurant somehow was slowly starting to come back together. One night, after Caroline had already gone to sleep in the makeshift space, Jack and Mark sat in the kitchen area. The silence was comfortable, almost familiar. Mark was making coffee, and Jack, always a man of few words, looked around as if he were absorbing every detail of the place. "I used to come here when your dad was still alive," Jack said suddenly, breaking the silence. Mark looked up, surprised. He didn't know Jack had known his father. "He was a good man. Everyone respected him," Jack continued. "I remember him. But over the years, as things got harder, he had lost sight of that ideal." "I guess I lost that," Mark confessed, his voice low, almost resigned. Jack looked at him with understanding, but without judgment. "We all lose things along the way, Mark," Jack said. "But sometimes what we think is lost is just waiting to be found again." Those words lingered in Mark's head as he looked around the empty restaurant. He knew something had to change, but he wasn't sure how to make it happen. He was on the verge of losing the restaurant, the last thing left of his family's heritage. However, the presence of Jack and Caroline brought a new dynamic that made him question what it really meant to keep that legacy alive. What Mark didn't yet know was that the small spark of hope reignited by Jack and Caroline's presence would confront him with decisions and sacrifices he never imagined making. The road ahead was full of challenges, and the truth was that not everything could be fixed as easily as a broken chair. The days at the restaurant continued with a strange routine. Jack and Caroline started feeling more comfortable in the space Mark had improvised for them. And little by little, the relationship between them and the owner became less formal. It was a cohabitation marked by small gestures. A shared cup of coffee in the morning, brief conversations over dinner, and even occasional laughter that echoed through the restaurant's empty walls. However, Mark knew he couldn't keep this situation up indefinitely. The bills kept coming, and the debts were piling up into what felt like an insurmountable mountain. Suppliers had already started cutting credit, and the pressure to sell the restaurant increased every day. His family, especially his older sister, called constantly, insisting that he get rid of the place. "You can't keep going like this, Mark." His sister Amanda's stern voice echoed over the phone in one of those calls. "The restaurant's done for. You need to accept that." Mark gripped the phone tightly, pacing back and forth in the small office of the restaurant, looking out the window at the empty dining room. The warm morning light filtered through the dusty windows, but it didn't ease the weight in his chest. "I know things are tough, Amanda, but He hesitated, not wanting to admit that, deep down, he was as lost as he seemed. "I'm just not ready to give up yet." Amanda sighed on the other end, her frustration evident. "It's not just about you, Mark. What do you think Dad would say if he saw the restaurant like this? You're only prolonging the inevitable. Sell it and move on. Start fresh. What happened to your plan to open a smaller place, something easier to manage?" Mark remained silent. The idea of opening a smaller restaurant had crossed his mind, but the truth was he couldn't let go of his father's legacy. The Harvest wasn't just a restaurant. It was a symbol of everything his family had built over the years. Giving up felt like betraying his father's memory. And now, with Jack and Carolyn under his roof, it felt like there was more at stake than just his own failures. "I just need more time, Amanda," he finally replied, his voice quieter. "You don't have more time, Mark," Amanda insisted. "The town's full of new, modern restaurants. People don't want what you're offering anymore. You need to adapt." When the call ended, Mark sat for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand, Amanda's words echoing in his mind. He knew she was right, but admitting that to himself was another matter. He stood up and walked into the dining room, where he found Jack fixing another one of the worn-out chairs. "They just keep breaking, huh?" Mark commented, trying to hide the tension he felt. Jack looked at the chair with a half-smile. "Well, with a little patience, anything can be fixed," he replied calmly. Jack's words, simple as they were, always carried a greater weight. Mark knew the advice applied much more to his life than to the old chairs in the restaurant. But what Jack might not have known was that some things inside Mark seemed broken beyond repair. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, Caroline approached Mark with a hesitant look on her face. "Mr. Mark, can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked nervously. Mark smiled gently, sitting on one of the stools near the counter. "Of course, Caroline. What's going on?" She fidgeted for a moment before finally speaking. I wanted to ask if you think I could go back to school." The question caught Mark by surprise. He knew Carolyn hadn't attended school for a while, ever since Jack's situation had worsened, leaving them on the streets. Her dream of becoming a doctor had always seemed distant, something Mark thought was buried deep in her mind, but it seemed the desire was still alive. "Caroline, he began, but stopped when he saw the hopeful gleam in her eyes. "I'd love to see you back in school, but I don't know if your father—" "I know it'll be hard," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "But I want to try. I want to be someone who can help, like I wanted to help my mom when she got sick. I want to learn, really." Mark's heart ached at hearing those words. He could see her determination, and somehow it inspired him. She was so young, but had already seen more suffering than any child should. And yet, her hope still shone like a flame that refused to go out. "I'll talk to your dad," Mark said finally. "But I think you should talk to him too. This is important." Caroline smiled, and the sparkle in her eyes brought an unexpected sense of comfort to Mark. He knew that somehow that moment was about more than just a decision about school. It was about believing that there was still a future for her, and maybe for all of them. Later that night, Jack was finishing putting away the tools he used for his repairs when Caroline approached him. The girl was visibly nervous but determined. "Dad, can I talk to you?" Jack, sensing the seriousness in his daughter's tone, stopped what he was doing and sat in one of the restaurant's chairs. "Sure, sweetie. What is it?" Caroline took a deep breath and began to talk about her desire to return to school. She explained how important it was to her, how she wanted to study to become a doctor, and how she felt this was her chance to start over. Jack listened in silence, his face serious and thoughtful. When she finished, Jack didn't respond right away. He looked at the floor, sadness evident in his eyes. "I wish I could give you that, Caroline," he began, his voice low and full of emotion. "I wish I could give you everything you deserve, but I don't know how. I can barely keep us off the streets." Caroline moved closer and took her father's hand. "Dad, we have Mr. Mark now, and he said he can help us. We can try." Jack looked into his daughter's eyes and saw the same determination she had always had. even in the worst situations. He knew how much this meant to her, but he also knew that life rarely offered second chances. Still, for Caroline, he was willing to try. "Let's talk to him," Jack finally said, squeezing his daughter's hand. As Mark watched from a distance, he sensed that something was changing. Maybe there was a way for all of them to get out of this situation. But fate. He knew the restaurant's financial situation was deteriorating rapidly, and that even if he wanted to help, there wouldn't be much time before the collapse became inevitable. The restaurant was the last thing connecting him to his family's legacy, but at the same time, he was aware that keeping it open was becoming less and less of a rational choice. The next morning, while preparing coffee, he overheard the soft sounds of Caroline and Jack talking in the back. She was excited about the idea of returning to school, while Jack tried to stay optimistic, even with the constant worry that he wouldn't be able to provide for his daughter. It stirred something in Mark that he couldn't quite express. Caroline, with her spark of hope, reminded him of how he had once been, full of dreams and plans, believing that anything was possible if he just worked hard enough. At the same time, Jack represented what he feared becoming, a man who had lost everything, struggling to survive and give something to his family, even when the world seemed determined to beat him down. Mark felt a growing connection with both of them, but that only made the situation harder. He couldn't save them, not if he couldn't save himself and the restaurant. When Jack approached Mark that afternoon to discuss the idea of Caroline going back to school, Mark had already been expecting it. "I don't know how we can make this happen," Jack said, looking directly into Mark's eyes. "But I have to try. She needs a chance." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility. "I want to help, Jack," he said slowly, "but you know the restaurant isn't in its best shape. I'm struggling to keep the doors open." Jack looked down, thoughtful. He knew this, of course, and also knew that asking more from Mark was almost an abuse of his kindness. Still, the desire to provide a future for his daughter outweighed his pride. "Maybe, if I could work more here," Jack suggested. "Help out with whatever. Not just the small stuff, but something more regular. I'd do anything to give her a chance." Mark was silent, thinking over the proposal. He knew Jack was a man of value, and hard work had always been one of his trademarks. But the restaurant didn't have enough business to justify hiring more help. Even so, Mark felt torn. He didn't want to leave Jack and Caroline without options, but he also knew he was on the verge of losing everything. "I'll think about it," Mark replied, trying to be sincere, though he knew the answer wouldn't be easy to find. In the days that followed, Mark found himself under increasing pressure. The debts continued to grow, and he knew he would soon have to make a final decision about the restaurant's future. His sister Amanda's calls became more frequent and increasingly insistent. "You need to stop delaying the inevitable," she said during one of those calls, her voice full of urgency. "If you keep going like this, there won't be anything left, and you won't be able to help anyone, not even yourself." Mark knew Amanda was right, but something held him back from taking that final step. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was his father's memory, which still lingered in every corner of the restaurant. He felt that by selling the restaurant, he wouldn't just be closing a business, but burying his family's story. It was on an especially cold night that Mark finally began to see a way out. He was sitting alone in the empty dining room, staring at the stacked chairs and the faded pictures on the walls. The town felt like a distant place, silent, as snow fell outside. Jack and Caroline were already asleep in the back, and Mark, sleepless, let himself sink into his worries. He remembered Jack's words about fixing things, about how with patience anything could be restored. The restaurant, like his own life, seemed hopelessly broken. But what if he could find a way to start over? Maybe the key wasn't trying to save the restaurant as it had always been, but transforming it into something new. The idea, though risky, began to take shape in his mind. Mark looked over at the kitchen, where he had spent countless hours learning from his father. Perhaps it was time to bring something fresh to the harvest. A new concept, a new style. If he could find a way to attract new customers, there might still be a chance to save the restaurant and help Jack and Caroline in the process. Mark spent the next few hours scribbling ideas into an old notebook. He thought of new dishes, community events that could draw more locals in. Winchester was a traditional town, but Mark believed there was room for innovation. He thought about using local ingredients, offering themed dinners and maybe even hosting a series of cooking workshops to engage the community. By dawn, he had the rough outline of a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Mark knew it would be hard, that he'd face resistance, from himself and others. But that small spark of hope, reignited by Jack and Caroline, was growing into something bigger. He had to try before it was too late. That morning, with the new plan fresh in his mind, Mark called Jack over to talk. They sat at one of the tables in the restaurant, the weak winter sun lighting up the empty hall. "Jack, I've been thinking," Mark began, hesitant. "Maybe there's a way to save the restaurant. And if it works, we might be able to keep you and Caroline here, and even find a way to get her back in school." Jack listened closely as Mark explained his ideas. He talked about the new dishes, the events, and the workshops that could bring customers in and breathe new life into the restaurant. Jack, though cautious, couldn't help but feel a small thread of hope forming in his heart. He knew Mark was putting everything on the line with this last attempt, and the risk was great. But what did they have to lose? The situation was already desperate. "If you're in, I'm in too," Jack said with determination. "Let's make this work, Mark." With Jack's support, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. They started working that same day, reorganizing the restaurant and planning their next steps. But as they made plans, an unseen danger loomed, something neither of them could foresee. The new plan sparked fresh energy in the restaurant. Over the following days, the two worked tirelessly. Mark spent hours in the kitchen, experimenting with new recipes, creating dishes that blended the restaurant's tradition with modern touches that might appeal to a younger, trendier crowd. Meanwhile, Jack continued repairing the accumulated damage from years of wear. With each chair fixed and each table restored, the place seemed to come alive again. Caroline, always present, helped however she could. Despite her young age, she displayed a maturity that often surprised Mark. She always found ways to be useful, whether cleaning tables or organizing utensils in the kitchen. More than that, her constant smile and optimistic spirit seemed to light up the restaurant in a way Mark hadn't thought possible. "You really want to be a doctor, don't you?" Mark asked Caroline one afternoon as she helped him chop vegetables. She smiled, the sparkle in her eyes undeniable. "I do," she said with conviction. "I want to help people, like you're helping us." Mark fell silent for a moment, absorbing her words. He had never thought of himself as someone who made a difference in others' lives. But looking at Caroline, he began to realize that, in some way, he was offering more than just shelter and food. He was offering a hope she hadn't seen in a long time. However, even with all the progress, time was running out. The debts continued to pile up, and the restaurant's bills had been overdue for months. The pressure from his family wasn't easing up either. Amanda, his sister, visited the restaurant one afternoon, and after seeing the changes, couldn't help but voice her concerns. "Mark, what are you doing?" she asked, looking at the newly arranged tables and the revamped menu board on the wall. "This is a waste of time and money. You can't save the restaurant with a few new chairs and different dishes." Mark turned to her, frustrated. "I'm not giving up, Amanda. If you can't see that, fine, but I need to try," he replied, more firmly than usual. Amanda watched him for a moment, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're digging yourself deeper," she said coldly. "There's no saving this, Mark. You need to accept reality." Mark felt the weight of his sister's words, but he refused to give in. For the first time in a long while, he felt there was something worth fighting for, and Caroline and Jack were part of that. By the end of the week, Mark organized a small event at the restaurant, something simple to test his new concept. He invited neighbors, former customers, and even a few close friends, offering a free tasting of the new dishes he had created. The goal was to reconnect with the community and hopefully attract new clients. Caroline, beaming with joy, was in charge of welcoming guests. With a smile on her face, she greeted each person who entered, handing out menus and guiding them to their tables. Jack, on the other hand, helped out in the kitchen and around the dining area, his face tired but visibly proud to be contributing to something bigger. The event, to Mark's surprise, was a success. People complimented the food, the new atmosphere, and most importantly, they acknowledged Mark's effort to bring something fresh to the town. For one night, the restaurant buzzed with conversations, something Mark hadn't heard in months. "I think we did it," Jack said to Mark at the end of the night, as the last guests were leaving. Mark smiled, relieved. For the first time, he felt there was a real chance to save the restaurant, and with that, offer a better future for Caroline. But as Jack and Mark quietly celebrated, something else was unfolding, something they couldn't foresee. Across town, someone was watching. A man in a dark suit, sitting in a car parked at a safe distance from the restaurant, observed the movement at the door with interest. He wasn't a customer nor a local. He worked for the bank that held the mortgage on the restaurant, and he was there to ensure that when the time came, everything would be ready. The next morning after the event, Mark received a letter. He opened it, his heart racing as he read the harsh words that sealed the fate of his efforts. The bank was demanding immediate payment of all outstanding debts. There were no more negotiations or extensions. If he didn't pay, the restaurant would be taken. The news hit him like a stone. The success of the previous night now felt insignificant. He knew that even with the increased clientele, he wouldn't be able to raise the necessary funds in time. The restaurant, the place his family had built with so much effort, was about to be taken from him. Mark didn't have the heart to tell Jack and Caroline right away. They were so hopeful, so invested in helping. He didn't want to crush the small ray of hope he had created. But he knew that soon, he wouldn't have a choice. Days passed and Mark tried everything he could to find a solution. He went to the bank, tried to renegotiate the terms, but nothing worked. The deadline was fast approaching, and he felt the desperation grow each day. Jack noticed the tension in Mark. He knew something was wrong, but decided not to press him until Mark was ready to talk. However, Caroline, with her sharp intuition, sensed that something serious was happening. "Mr. Mark, is everything okay?" she asked one afternoon, her voice full of concern. Mark looked at her, and for a moment, he thought about lying. There's still time. But Mark knew it wasn't that simple. Reality was relentless, and he was about to lose everything. What he didn't know was that the loss would be much greater than he imagined. That night, as Mark was closing the restaurant, he heard a noise at the door. Jack walked in, his expression grave. He had found out about the bank's letter. The silence between them was heavy, full of unspoken words. "You've done all you could, Mark," Jack finally said. "But sometimes, some things just can't be saved." Mark didn't respond. He knew Jack was right. The restaurant was doomed. And with it, it seemed, everyone's hope was crumbling. But there was something more, something they couldn't predict, something that was about to change everything. The next morning arrived, heavy with the weight of looming defeat. Gray clouds covered the sky over Winchester, reflecting Mark's emotional state. He knew the end was near, that there was no more time or resources to save the restaurant. The bank's deadline was about to expire, and he still hadn't found a viable solution. Jack was quieter than usual. Even after hearing about the letter, he continued helping around the restaurant, fixing what he could, as if there was still hope. Caroline, on the other hand, maintained her determination, insisting that something could still be done, as if her youth and resilience alone could change the harsh reality surrounding them. While Mark worked in the kitchen, the phone rang. He answered, feeling a wave of anxiety before even hearing the voice on the other end. "Mr. Harrison, this is Mr. Taylor from the bank. I'm calling to remind you that the final payment deadline is tomorrow." The voice was cold, as if delivering a sentence without emotion. "If the payment is not made, we'll send a team to take over the restaurant at the beginning of next week." Mark tried to stay calm, but his hands trembled. He knew this call was coming, but hearing the final words made everything feel all the more real. "Understood," was all he could manage before hanging up. He sat down, resting his head in his hands, feeling the weight of imminent defeat. Everything he had fought for, the restaurant that symbolized his family's legacy, was about to be taken away. He didn't know how to break the news to Jack and Caroline. They had already suffered so much, and now, once again, they were about to lose everything. In that moment of despair, the kitchen door slowly opened. Jack entered, his eyes tired, but determined. He seemed to have something important to say. "Mark, I've been thinking a lot about what's happening," Jack began, approaching the counter. "I know you've done everything to help us, and I'll never be able to thank you enough. but I can't keep watching you sacrifice what little you have left for us." Mark looked at Jack, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I know what's at stake here," Jack continued, "and I can't just stand by hoping things will work themselves out. I've already lost everything once, and I survived. But Caroline..." Jack's voice trembled slightly as he mentioned his daughter's name. "She can't keep living like this. She needs stability, a future, and you need a chance to start over." Mark felt a lump in his throat. He understood what Jack was trying to say, but the thought of losing the small family that had formed there was too painful. "What are you suggesting?" Mark asked, his voice weak. Jack looked directly into Mark's eyes. "Caroline and I are going to leave. We'll move out of the restaurant and try to find another place to stay. That'll give you a chance to focus on saving the restaurant without having to worry about us." Mark was silent, shocked by the suggestion. He didn't want Jack and Caroline to leave. They had become part of this place and, in a way, part of his life. But he also knew Jack was right. The chances of saving the restaurant were slim, and perhaps by shedding the added responsibility of caring for them, he might have the smallest chance of surviving. "I can't do that," Mark finally said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You're the only good thing left here." Jack smiled sadly. "You'll always have us, but now you need to fight for yourself. We'll figure something out, one way or another." That night, after the restaurant closed, Jack told Caroline about the decision to leave. The girl, who had remained strong until then, was overcome with sadness. She didn't want to leave the restaurant, the place that had become her home, even if only temporarily. More than that, she didn't want to leave Mark, the man who had gradually become like a father figure to her. "But Dad, what about Mr. Mark?" Caroline asked, tears welling in her eyes. "He needs us too." Jack knelt before his daughter, holding her hands. "I know, sweetheart, but Mark needs space to try to save the restaurant. He's done so much for us. Now it's our turn to let him fight for it." Caroline cried silently, and Jack embraced her, feeling his heart tighten. He knew he was doing what was best for her, but it didn't make the decision any easier. The next morning, before the sun rose, Jack and Caroline packed up their few belongings and prepared to leave. Mark found them in the dining room, feeling a mix of sadness and guilt. He knew he couldn't stop them, but the emptiness they would leave behind would be hard to bear. "Thank you, Mark, for everything," Jack said sincerely. Mark tried to smile, but he couldn't hide the pain he felt. "I should be the one thanking you. You've given me more than you know." Caroline ran to Mark and hugged him tightly. He returned the embrace, feeling like he was losing something incredibly precious. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "I'll be back, Mr. Mark. When I'm a doctor, I'll come back here," she said with a determination that deeply moved him. Mark nodded, unable to find the words. He watched as Jack and Caroline walked out the door, and the sound of it closing echoed through the empty restaurant. Mark stood still for a long time, staring at the door they had left through. The restaurant was empty again, but this time, the emptiness felt much deeper. He knew now he was completely alone, facing the imminent collapse of his business. Yet something inside him refused to give up. Maybe it was Caroline's determination still echoing in his mind, or maybe it was Jack's resilient spirit, who, even with everything against him, kept fighting. Mark knew there was still a chance, even if it was slim. He picked up the phone and made one last call to the bank. He explained the situation, begged for more time, offering anything he could as collateral. But the response on the other end was clear. The deadline expired that day. There would be no more extensions. Desperate, Mark hung up the phone and felt the tears begin to well up. Everything he had done, all the struggles, were about to fall apart. He looked around the restaurant, the empty dining room, the tables Jack had so carefully repaired, and knew the end was near. But fate had one last twist in store, something that would change everything in a matter of hours. After Jack and Caroline's departure, the restaurant felt emptier than ever. Mark's footsteps echoed through the walls like a constant reminder of his solitude. He wondered if he had made the right choice in letting them go, but the doorbell of the restaurant rang, something that hadn't happened in days. He glanced at the clock. It was late, almost closing time. Who could it be? He approached the door, and when he opened it, he was greeted by the sight of a well-dressed woman with a serious expression on her face. "Mr. Harrison?" she asked, her voice firm and professional. "I'm Rachel Collins, an attorney. I work for the bank that holds the mortgage on the restaurant." Mark felt his chest tighten. This was the visit he had been dreading. The bank was no longer willing to wait, and now the lawyer was here to formalize the closing of the restaurant. He fought the urge to beg for more time, knowing it would be useless. "I understand why you're here," Mark began, his voice tired. "But I've already tried everything. There's nothing more I can do." Rachel observed him for a moment, as if assessing something. Then, she pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the nearest table. "Mr. Harrison, I'm here for a different reason," she said, her voice softening slightly. "I need to discuss a delicate matter with you." Mark frowned, confused. He had been expecting an ultimatum, an order to hand over the keys and walk away from the restaurant. Instead, the woman seemed hesitant, as if she was about to tell him something he couldn't have foreseen. "I know this restaurant has been part of your family for generations," she began, sitting down in one of the chairs. "But recently, something came up in our records, something that changes the whole situation." Mark remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "This restaurant, the property where it's located, actually doesn't belong to the bank," she finally said, and the surprise on Mark's face was impossible to hide. "What do you mean?" Mark asked, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. Rachel opened the folder she had brought and pulled out some documents, laying them in front of Mark. "The mortgage your father took out many years ago was fully paid off before his death. However, there was a mistake in the bank's system. They continued charging payments and applying interest as if the debt was still outstanding. In reality, Mr. Harrison, this restaurant has been debt-free for over 5 years." Mark looked at the papers in front of him, stunned. He grabbed them, flipping through quickly, trying to absorb the information. How could this be true? Had he spent the past years fighting non-existent debts? This has to be some kind of mistake," Mark said, feeling hope rise within him, but not yet sure he could believe it. "It's not a mistake," Rachel confirmed. "It's negligence on the bank's part, and according to the law, the bank owes you compensation for this. In addition to refunding all the money that was wrongly paid over these years, the bank will also be required to cover the moral and financial damages you've suffered due to this error." Mark was in shock. He had spent years believing he was on the verge of collapse, that his family's legacy was about to be destroyed. And now he discovered that the restaurant had always been his, that his fight against financial ruin had been based on a bureaucratic error that could have been avoided. He felt betrayed, but at the same time, grateful to finally have an answer, a solution. "So, I'm not going to lose the restaurant?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. "No," Rachel confirmed. "The restaurant is yours, and you'll also receive significant financial compensation. The bank wants to avoid a lawsuit, so they're willing to settle this amicably if you're agreeable." Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was as if a massive weight had been lifted off his shoulders. For so long, he had struggled to keep the doors open, believing he was destined to fail. And now, everything had changed. I don't know what to say," he admitted, still in disbelief. "This changes everything." Rachel smiled slightly, recognizing Mark's relief. "I imagine it does. I'll leave you to process all this," she said, standing to leave. "When you're ready to discuss the settlement terms, just give me a call." Mark nodded, still unable to find the right words. He walked her to the door, still trying to comprehend the magnitude of the change that had just occurred. Once Rachel left, he stood for a long time staring at the empty dining room. The restaurant was his. It had always been his, and now he had a second chance to start over. In the days that followed, Mark began reorganizing the restaurant with a new energy. The debts that had tormented him were no longer a problem. He could now invest properly in the restaurant, bringing back the shine that the Harvest had in its glory days. As soon as Rachel left, he stood still for a long time, staring at the empty hall. The restaurant was his. It always had been. And now, he had a second chance to start over. In the days that followed, Mark began reorganizing the restaurant with renewed energy. The debts that had plagued him were no longer a problem. He could invest in the restaurant properly, bringing back the shine the harvest had in its glory days. The financial settlement from the bank would be enough to cover any necessary repairs and, hopefully, give him the stability he so desperately needed. But something was missing. Something that bothered him deeply. Jack and Caroline. Without them, the restaurant felt incomplete. He had found a new opportunity to rebuild the business, but he didn't want to do it without the people who had, in a way, helped save his hope. Mark knew what he had to do. That afternoon, he got in his car and started looking for Jack and Caroline. It wasn't easy, as they could be anywhere in the city. He drove through the cold streets of Winchester, stopping at shelters and asking people who might have seen the father and daughter. After hours of searching, he finally found them in a small makeshift shelter in a park. Caroline was sitting next to Jack, with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and her face lit up when she saw Mark. "Mr. Mark!" she exclaimed, running to hug him. Jack stood up, surprised, but smiled when he saw Mark there. "What are you doing here?" Jack asked. Mark smiled with evident emotion in his voice. "The restaurant is mine. It always was. And I want you to come back. I want you to be part of this new beginning." Jack and Caroline exchanged glances, surprised and emotional. Mark told them about the bank, the turnaround that changed everything. And in the end, he extended his hand to Jack. "Shall we do this together?" Jack, with tear-filled eyes, shook Mark's hand. "Let's do it." In the days that followed, Jack and Caroline returned to the restaurant, and together they began to rebuild what was left. Caroline went back to helping Mark in the kitchen, and Jack, as always, got to work keeping the place running. The restaurant, once a symbol of defeat, was now becoming a beacon of hope. And so, with a lot of hard work, the harvest began to be reborn, stronger than ever. Old customers returned, new ones started coming in, and the restaurant quickly became the beating heart of Winchester's community. But fate still had one last surprise in store for them, one that would change their lives in an unexpected way. Days passed with renewed energy in the restaurant. The harvest was thriving, coming to life again, as if the dark past of uncertainties and debts was just a distant memory. Mark, Jack, and Caroline worked together to transform the place, and the Winchester community started to notice. The tables were now almost always full, and the buzz of happy conversations filled the air. The restaurant had once again become a refuge for good times, just like it had been in Mark's father's day. However, despite all the success, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something more was about to happen. There was a tension in the air, as if fate was about to intervene one last time. One afternoon, while Caroline was helping in the kitchen and Jack was fixing the storage room door, a man entered the restaurant. He was dressed in an elegant suit, but there was something in his expression that immediately caught Mark's attention. The man didn't seem like a regular customer. He walked to the counter and sat down, his gaze fixed on Mark, as if he were there for a specific reason. "Mr. Harrison?" the man asked in a low, calm voice. Mark stopped what he was doing and approached, feeling a chill. There was something about this man that made him uneasy, but he couldn't say what it was. "That's me," Mark replied, drying his hands on a cloth. "How can I help you?" The man handed over a card, identifying himself as William Cooper, a lawyer from a prestigious firm in Winchester. Mark frowned, confused. "I don't understand," Mark said, examining the card. "I've already resolved everything with the bank." William smiled, but his smile brought no relief. "I'm not here about the bank, Mr. Harrison. I'm here for another reason. Something related to the restaurant's past." He paused, watching Mark's reaction. "To your family's past?" Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know what this man was talking about, but the mention of his family and the restaurant in such a serious tone put him on alert. "Go on," Mark said, now fully attentive. "I believe you're not aware of an important fact," William began, keeping his voice low. "This restaurant, the property where it's located, has belonged to a secret society of investors since your grandfather's time." Mark was completely stunned by the statement. A secret society? This sounded like something out of a conspiracy book, something that couldn't possibly be connected to what he knew as his family's simple, honest history. "What are you saying?" Mark asked, confused and irritated. This restaurant was built by my grandfather and passed down to my father. It's been in our family for decades. Yes, that's true, William nodded. But what you may not know is that your grandfather made a deal many years ago with an influential organization in Winchester. They secretly invested in the restaurant, ensuring its success in exchange for future favors. Now the favors are being called in. Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. The idea that his grandfather might have made a dark deal behind everything his family stood for seemed absurd. He shook his head, trying to push away the shock. That doesn't make sense, he protested. My grandfather would never have done something like that. He was an honest, respected man. I'm not here to question your grandfather's character, Mr. Harrison, William continued, unfazed. I'm here to inform you that the society expects compensation. The time of the agreement has expired, and now they want the restaurant. Mark felt as if the ground had opened beneath him. He had fought so hard to save the restaurant, to honor his family's legacy, and now he was finding out that it could all be taken from him because of a shady deal made in the past. He didn't know if he believed William's story, but the man seemed serious and very well informed. And what if I refuse? Mark asked, defiantly crossing his arms. William looked at him with a calculated expression. I wouldn't advise that, Mr. Harrison. This organization has more power than you can imagine. And when they want something, they get it. It would be better to come to a peaceful agreement. Mark remained silent, processing the words. His heart was racing, and he felt trapped. How could he fight something like this? He had fought so hard to keep the restaurant alive, only to now face an even more dangerous and unforeseen threat. I'll need time to think, Mark finally said, trying to gain some control over the situation. William nodded. Of course, Mr. Harrison, but don't take too long. The people I represent don't have much patience, he said with a slight threat in his voice, standing to leave. Once the man was gone, Mark felt as though he was caught in the middle of an invisible storm. He didn't know what to do, but one thing was certain. The restaurant was once again at risk, and this time the forces against him were much darker than he could have imagined. Mark spent the night sleepless, trying to process what he had learned. He wondered if William was telling the truth or if this was just a tactic to scare him into giving up the restaurant. But the possibility that it was real haunted him. What are you going to do? She finally asked. Mark looked at her, realizing the weight of the decision he had to make. He didn't want to give up, but the threat was real. He had promised himself he wouldn't let the restaurant die, but now it seemed like the forces against him were bigger than anything he could face alone. I don't know, he admitted, feeling more vulnerable than ever. But deep in his mind, something told him it wasn't over. He knew there were more secrets buried in his family's history, and if he wanted to save the restaurant for good, he would have to uncover the full truth before it was too late. In the following days, Mark couldn't think of anything but William Cooper's visit and the alleged secret society. The idea that his family was involved in something so dark haunted him. He felt that he needed to understand the truth before deciding what to do. After all, his grandfather had never mentioned anything like this, and his childhood in the restaurant had always been peaceful and full of good memories. But now, that peace had turned into a cloud of uncertainty. That night, after closing the restaurant, Mark decided to search through his father's old office in the back. The place was filled with piles of old documents, financial records, letters, and photos, all things he had stored away without really looking at, since the restaurant had become his responsibility. If there was anything about this mysterious agreement, it had to be among those papers. Caroline helped with the search, excited about solving a mystery. She sifted through boxes of files while Mark carefully read through every piece of paper, looking for any clue that made sense. Maybe we should look for the oldest documents, Caroline suggested, with the wisdom only a determined child could have. If Mr. Cooper talked about an agreement from your grandpa's time, it won't be in the recent stuff. Mark smiled, impressed by her observation. You're right. Let's start with the files from the 1950s and 60s, when my grandfather was still running the restaurant. As Mark and Caroline sifted through the old documents, something caught Caroline's eye. It was a wooden box, locked and covered in dust, tucked away on a shelf. She pulled it out with some difficulty, sensing she had found something important. "Mr. Mark, look what I found," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with anticipation. Mark looked at the box and felt a chill down his spine. He had never seen it before. It looked old, almost as if it had been deliberately hidden there. He wiped the dust from the surface and tried to open it, but it was locked. Determined to find out what was inside, he grabbed a screwdriver and forced the lock. After a few minutes of effort, the box opened with a dry snap. Inside were several yellowed documents and a leather-bound notebook in his grandfather's handwriting. Mark picked up the notebook and began to read. His grandfather's journal started out ordinary, with notes about the day-to-day life at the restaurant, recipes he was testing, and reflections on the customers. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted to something darker. There were mentions of financial struggles and external pressures his grandfather faced to keep the restaurant afloat during an economic crisis in the 1950s. Then, in an entry dated 1958, his grandfather mentioned a meeting with a group of private investors. They presented themselves as friends of the community, willing to help small businesses survive in tough times. But their help didn't come without a price. In the journal, his grandfather described in detail the pact he made with these men. They would provide the necessary money to save the restaurant, but in exchange, control over the property would be partially ceded to them as collateral for future negotiations. There was a clause stating that if the restaurant thrived beyond a certain profit margin, the investors would have the right to claim the property. And the most chilling part, the deadline for this agreement to expire was precisely now, in 2024. Mark felt sick as he read those words. His grandfather, a man he had always considered honest, had made a dangerous deal without ever mentioning it to the family. And now, he was paying the price for it. Caroline, who was beside him, remained silent for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the situation. "So, the restaurant belongs to them now?" she asked, wide-eyed. "Not yet," Mark replied, his voice tense. "But they have the right to claim it. Unless I can figure out a way to nullify this agreement." Mark knew he couldn't give in to fear and simply hand over the restaurant without a fight. He wasn't going to allow his family's legacy to be destroyed by a pact made decades ago. If William Cooper and his clients wanted the restaurant, they would have to face Mark before getting their hands on it. The next morning, Mark called Rachel Collins, the lawyer who had helped him with the bank. He told her everything he had discovered, from his grandfather's journal to William Cooper's visit. Rachel listened intently. "Mark, this is serious," she finally said. "If this agreement is legally valid, they have a strong case to claim the restaurant. But I'll need to see these documents. There may be a loophole, something your grandfather didn't consider at the time." "I'll send you copies of everything," Mark replied with renewed hope. "I trust you to help me get out of this." While waiting for Rachel's analysis, Mark decided to prepare for whatever was coming. He warned Jack and Carolyn about the possibility of a legal battle, and they agreed to stand by his side. The Harvest had become more than just a restaurant for them. It was a symbol of resilience and fighting for something greater. Days later, William Cooper returned to the restaurant, this time with a more urgent air. He entered with the same controlled smile, but this time, Mark was ready. "Mr. Harrison, I hope you've had time to reflect," William said bluntly. "Are you ready to sign the papers and avoid bigger problems?" Mark looked at him firmly, feeling his anger rising inside. "I've read my grandfather's documents. I know about the pact. But I also know there are things you're not telling me," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "My lawyer is reviewing everything. If you think you can just walk in here and take the restaurant, you're mistaken." William raised an eyebrow, surprised by Mark's resistance. "So you want a legal fight?" William asked, his tone slightly threatening. "I want justice," Mark responded, his eyes locked on the lawyer. "And if that means fighting to the end, then yes, I'm prepared." William remained silent for a moment, as if reconsidering his options. He knew Mark was determined, but the society he worked for wasn't the kind to easily accept defeat. "I see you're resolute," William finally said with a cold smile. "Very well, Mr. Harrison. We'll see how this plays out." He turned and left the restaurant, leaving Mark, Jack, and Caroline feeling the tension in the air. But Mark was no longer alone. He had Rachel, Jack, and Caroline by his side. And now, he was willing to fight to the end to protect the restaurant that meant so much to him and to everyone around him. Mark felt the weight of what was coming. but his determination to fight for the restaurant and his family's legacy was stronger than ever. Rachel had spent days analyzing all the documents he had found, and now she was ready to present a solid defense against the secret society. Time was running out, and the final confrontation was about to happen. On the morning of the trial, the atmosphere in the restaurant was tense. Jack and Caroline were there to support Mark, while Rachel reviewed her arguments one last time. The case seemed complicated. The secret society had a strong legal basis, but Rachel believed there was a loophole, which could be Mark's salvation. "We're ready," Rachel said to Mark as they headed to court. "Trust me, Mark. We'll fight with everything we've got." The courtroom was packed. On one side, Mark and Rachel. On the other, William Cooper and a group of lawyers representing the secret society. The judge entered the room, and the trial began. Rachel was the first to present her case. She detailed the pact made by Mark's grandfather. This pact, made decades ago, not only exploits a family in a moment of financial vulnerability, but was also violated by the society that established it, Rachel argued. They did not fulfill all their obligations over the years, and this nullifies their ability to claim the restaurant now. William Cooper, in his defense, insisted that the secret society had undisputed legal rights. He argued that regardless of how things had played out, the pact was clear. The restaurant came under their control starting in 2024. The trial was long, with both sides presenting their evidence. Mark watched in silence, trusting Rachel's work, but feeling the heavy fear of losing everything. The verdict. After hours of deliberation, the judge finally called for silence in the room. Mark felt his heart race as the judge leafed through the documents on his desk. Then he began to speak. "After reviewing all the evidence presented, I conclude that the pact made by Mr. Harrison's grandfather, although legally binding, contained execution flaws by the parties involved. The secret society did not fulfill all contractual obligations over the decades, and therefore, the right to claim the restaurant, the harvest, is nullified." The judge paused for a moment, looking directly at William Cooper. "The restaurant remains the property of Mr. Mark Harrison." The relief that washed over Mark was immediate. He felt the weight of months of uncertainty melt away. Jack and Caroline, seated at the back of the room, could barely hold back tears of happiness. Rachel shook Mark's hand, smiling. "We did it," she said, with a victorious gleam in her eyes. On the other side of the room, William Cooper stood in silence. He looked directly at Mark, but this time there were no threats in his eyes, only acceptance. "This isn't over for us," William said, his voice calm but dark. "But it's over for me. I didn't expect this fight, Mr. Harrison. Congratulations." And without another word, he left the courtroom. The new dawn back at the restaurant, Mark, Jack, and Caroline celebrated like never before. The harvest was saved, and now they could finally look toward the future with hope. The restaurant, which had been the center of so many struggles and challenges, had now become a symbol of resilience and triumph. In the months following the trial, the harvest flourished. More customers came, drawn by the story of the place and the exceptional food that Mark and Jack lovingly prepared. Caroline returned to school, and in her free moments she helped at the restaurant, always smiling and radiating the same hope that had kept everyone united. As for Mark, he knew that no matter what challenges he faced in the future, he would always have the people by his side, and that was more powerful than any external threat. He had faced the dark past of his family and emerged victorious. One morning, as he looked at the restaurant filled with happy customers, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. The harvest wasn't just a business, it was a legacy, a symbol of everything he, Jack, and Caroline had fought for. And now, finally, that legacy was secure.